Okay, so good morning. I'm Hal Finkel. I am the research director for OSCAR, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this morning. I know, of course, you've been here for a while, but I just got here, so I'll welcome you. And I would very much like to hope we have a great, informative, and very entertaining set of discussions this morning, and I am looking forward to that as much as you are. So it is my pleasure to start us off by introducing our first speaker, Luis Rangel DaCosta. He comes to us from the University of California, Berkeley, and did 2 practicums at Argonne National Laboratory. So, Luis, take it away.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me, of course. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some simulation and machine learning approaches for looking at atomic scale characterization in material science via transmission electron microscopy. And first, I wanted to talk about what this transmission electron microscope actually is. It's a big old microscope. It's about 20 feet tall. It's in an isolated room on an isolated foundation. And it is a fantastic instrument that has a lot of different experimental modalities, and it's really great at achieving super high spatial and spectroscopic resolution. So we can achieve imaging and spectroscopy at sub-angstrom resolution in space, and sub-eV, and sometimes sub-tenths of EVs in energy. And so you can get really fantastic images. This is the Team 1 microscope at the National Center for Electron Microscopy in the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where I work. The way this works is by, you have typically an electron gun at the top. In the middle here is a SEM image of an electron gun. You rip electrons from this electron gun around 200,000 volts. These electrons go somewhere between 40 and 50% speed of light. They hit a really small piece of material and they start scattering and diffracting. And in the process, you get images of things, maybe like this. This is an image on the top of some gold nanoparticles. And the bottom is the cropped out region of inside. If you look towards these little white and black contrast speckles, these white speckles in particular are columns of gold atoms. And so with this instrument, you can see atoms. And in the material science, if you guys have heard of this sort of structure property paradigm, getting this instructional information is really key for understanding exactly how these material systems work. And so I got started in transmission electron microscopy way back in 2018 as an undergrad at University of Wisconsin for a summer there. I was working with this team who's developing a machine learning approach to predict the thickness of crystals based off this image on the left here called packed beds. It's a convergent beam electron diffraction pattern that's averaged over unit cells. And there's enough image information in the fine structure of these probes to figure out how thick a material is to the unit cell, which is a really great technique, really great for understanding some synthesis processes. And I had a lot of fun. One of the big challenges that I had to deal with is training these machine learning algorithms to predict this thickness, is that I needed a lot of data. And so I started using the simulation software called Prismatic. It didn't quite do what I needed to do, so I went into the source code, messed around, futzed it, and changed it up to fix what I did, and managed to get this project to work. And in that time, I also started falling in love with 2 things. The first was actually looking at sort of microscopy data. This isn't quite the image I first saw, but the first time that I was at a microscope with the grad student I was working with, I saw an image just like this of strontium titanate come up on the live camera feed. And to me, it was just amazing. It was to see atoms like this, just so clear, was just phenomenal. For me, it was kind of like for the first time I saw stars at night. I grew up in Houston, so I didn't really get to see them very often. And the second thing I fell in love with was this. Watching machine learning models just progress. I got addicted to the terminal. I started watching these things train throughout lunch and all these sort of things. And now I'm still stuck with that. And then I continued this. The original writers of the software kind of appreciated that I was able to dig in and mess with things and improve it. And so they invited me to come to Lawrence Berkeley National Lab for 2 summers to work on that software again. And in that time, I also worked on some TEM simulation algorithms and software approaches. Here's a result from this one algorithm I happen to implement called scattering matrix refocusing, which lets you simulate really large, thick materials at really high defocuses and get better accuracy and errors. But I also spent a lot of my time fixing my own bugs. And so this is one of my favorite figures from the time. I had my first bug with parallel computing was not seeding my RNGs correctly. So I had a bunch of different processes working on parameterizing atomic potential, and they all had the same RNG seed. So I would get correlated diffraction patterns in here, which was really buggy and really wrong. And so this was one of the first figures I got out when I finally fixed that bug. And I saved it because I thought it looked like the Earth and thought it was really fun. So I had a lot of experience early on getting into TEM simulation, and a little bit about how that model works. Here on the right is some examples of what simulated TM data looks like and what experimental data looks like on the bottom. Hopefully you find that they're a little similar to like a trained TM expert. Maybe they could tell a difference, but hopefully you guys can. The forward model is pretty simple for some of these more complicated quantum mechanical models. You have an atomic structure. You split it up into really thin slices, and then you parameterize the scattering potential in each of those thin slices based on those atoms. And as long as that slice is thin enough, you can make what's called a weak phase approximation, whereas an electron wave function goes through this material, it accumulates phase in each slice, and then after it accumulates phase, it propagates in free space. Accumulates phase, propagates in free space. It's called the multi-slice algorithm, where it goes through multiple slices in this way. And in computation, the way this is implemented is at the top, on the top left here, just Fourier transform, multiply, Fourier transform back, multiply, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so this is one algorithm that we have a lot of implementations for. For high resolution TEM, we only have to simulate one plane wave going through a material, so we can do this in high throughput, but for some scanning probe techniques, we have to simulate many plane waves at once. So in this case with HRTM, we have a way to access high throughput data really quickly. And this kind of immediately points to an opportunity to provide data sets for machine learning via supervised learning techniques. And one way we can think about making that workflow is if we have access to a structure we can put through the simulation, we can take that structure and simulate it in two ways, on the substrate or in a realistic sample of interest, and generate an image as in the top right. But since we have access to the structure, we can begin to make supervised labels in a very informed, physics-based and ground truth way. For example, if we wanted to know where that nanoparticle is, a problem in the image space known as image segmentation, we can simulate just a nanoparticle. We can use some physics-based information about where that nanoparticle is. Here, the phase of the electron wave function as it passes through the material, which we can't access experimentally. And then use that phase to create a threshold and create a mask that is based on how that particle actually looks or should be. One problem, though, at the time when I started on this project in grad school is that we don't actually have the structures. Where do we get these structures from? Making these structures and making enough structures for a machine learning problem is actually really difficult. And getting access to that, it was a big barrier to implementing these algorithms and actually doing what should have been an easy problem to solve. And so that was the first thing I did. I made a package for myself to make these structures. It's called the construction zone. It's kind of fun. It's basically a little CAD system, a constructive geometry system. You have some stasis, you put things in them, you are able to control these objects and interact with them. And importantly for me, you're able to do them in a repeatable way, you're able to sample them, and you're able to make many thousands of, say, similar nanoparticle distributions very quickly. You're also able to make more complex things and stuff like that. I didn't need them at the time. And this works. So I was able to train some segmentation models to analyze experimental data with some neural network models that were purely trained on simulated data. In the TM space, this is really nice because we have a forward model that is really accurate to what the experimental data is. Basically, everything that I didn't account for in the simulations is just camera effects, which are, in this case, minor. And we can see that it works. I have some various models here that I'm showing the results of. Ones that did train pretty well, ones that didn't train pretty well. And we compare these results to some expert hand-annotated labels, which are really hard to access experimentally because there's just a lot of labor. And on the right here, I have just a plot showing the data size dependence of these networks. And a little low contrast, but the maximum and minimum performance. And maybe there's two things that stand out here, is that we need several thousands of images to kind of saturate performance on these problems, which is not something we can access experimentally. And there's a lot of variability in those low data spaces. But we're able to simulate enough data and get there. And it's nice that it works. I was like, cool result, that's fun. Not too surprising that if we have enough data, if we have a good source of data, that it will work. And I started getting more interested and worried about, like, when will this work? And so one thing I positive, maybe one theme you've heard throughout the week, is that getting these models to consistently work and to consistently work well requires a good source of data. For example, in the simulation process, if I make a bunch of low quality simulations versus a bunch of higher quality simulations, including some post-processing effects, including some like thermal averaging effects, for example, how much does that affect the performance of these models? I'm able to test that. I have access to the source of data. You can see, for example, what a low quality versus high quality simulation image looks like at the bottom right. It improves the model performance. And if we're very careful about how we choose that data, the quality of the data we choose, and the actual composition of that data set, we can decrease this data set dependence here. Very small marker in the top left, but going from around 8,000 images for a model that performs out of, say, 0.85 score here, to around 1,000 images, which is a significant decrease in the number of data points you need to train these models, and in the long run, a significant decrease in the amount of compute you need to get these models to work in an experimental context. And this is good, this is fun. I'm happy that now I also have some results and some practical guidelines for getting a good model in a more cheap fashion. But again, when does it work? And how well will it work? And will it work across different scenarios? At the NSEM, at the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, it's a user facility where many users come to do their experiments, similar to how NERSC is a user facility for people to do their computing work. And if they're using our models, if they're using some techniques we developed, will it work for their experiment? Will it work for many of their different samples? How much does this depend on different samples and the imaging conditions? And very thankfully, I've had collaborators who've done a lot of experimental work and have gone through the work of making their hand labels. And I'm able to measure across different experimental data sets. And one of the first things I noticed is that with one of my collaborators in particular, she was able to get 3 experimental data sets that look very similar in performance on the right here. These 3 different gold nanoparticle data sets which seem to trend a much stronger correlation than I've ever really seen before in machine learning. And this indicates to me that there's something going on here with these data sets that lets us say that there is some consistent generalization behavior happening with our simulated process. I'll skip this example of how generalization works to pass it for time. But measuring generalization practically is a lot of work. In experiments, we can do this by taking many different data sets and just comparing performance, a really brute force approach. We can do the same with simulation and with neural networks, but it still requires, 1, to produce all these data sets, and 2, to train all these different models and actually measure that. And what I would really like is a way to predict how these models generalize and how much worse these models will get. For example, in a measurement context, will I start to measure the wrong size of these particles? Will my predictions be incorrect? And by how much? And how much can I trust this model? One particular sort of generalization capacity that I would like to understand is over image defocus, an imaging setting in the microscope. Very similar to sort of camera defocus. TM is a projection process where the electron wave function can be focused on a different part of the cell. And in the TM, you have a really nonlinear sense of what the image happens due to self-interaction between the wave function. And on the right here, you can see that based on what your training defocus is and what sort of images you're testing on, your performance can be really dissimilar. And there are some settings where you increase performance and you decrease performance. It's not quite straightforward. And so continuing on another thing that one of my other fellow brought up earlier, ML gives you a space to be really creative with some of the things you can try and do. And so I came up with this little heuristic approach earlier this year to see, okay, could I predict generalization or at least find a measure that correlates with how much worse my model's gonna get? I take one of my segmentation models, I train it, I get it pretty good. I pop off the end of it. I put a classifier in the end. And to make it a little bit smaller, I first begin by taking a random projection with a random orthogonal matrix. And then I take all the data sets I want to measure generalization performance on and try to classify those data sets into different categories. This can be whatever category you want. Here are the semantic categories of defocus. I train that classifier, and then I take the features from that classifier, and then I embed them into a lower rank space. Here I use a UMAP embedding, which is Universal Manifold Approximation and Projection Algorithm, and embed that in space. And you can see here now these different data sets are forming a kind of a structured space. And in this structured space, I can begin to measure differences between data sets. And here we can get a difference between data set confusion matrix similar to what this generalization confusion matrix look like. And if we compare these two, how much loss we induce by training on performing on a different data set and the distance between data sets, you can see first visually they're kind of similar. In terms of rank correlation, they're not super similar. Here I use the Wasserstein distance first. It's okay, it looks good for now. There's some issues here. It's symmetric and maybe it shouldn't be symmetric. And so I also tried the KL divergence, which is not by definition symmetric. It turned out symmetric anyway. And so now I'm at a point where there might be something fishy going on still. Like, am I just working too small of a problem? Have I not explored enough data sets? And this is really where recently high performance computing has come in to sort of help me answer this question. So not only am I looking at just several models, so in those last plots, just 5 models per row, I can now train thousands of models and see how does generalization behavior trends over different sets of focus and all throughout the training dynamics of the model. And so recently I've run around 3,500 models on NERSC over different defocus data sets, over different hypervariant configurations. This data set took around 1,200 GPU hours. It only cost me 600 GPU hours because of a large node discount currently available at Perlmutter. And with these dynamics, I'm able to study this generalization phenomena much more granularly and see at what stages do these models begin to have good generalization behavior, how does it evolve over model performance, and how does it evolve over time. For example, if we increase batch size, it looks like these dynamics shift in time. When we increase learning rate, it looks like they shift in time again, a little bit accelerated. And even when we begin overtraining, that the variance of how you perform outside of distribution begins to grow. And so what's next for me? For these generalization studies, figuring out how a better way to get this to work consistently and in what settings it works, and uncovering a little bit more about like why some of these things seem a little bit more inconsistent than I would first think. And for machine learning and TEM, really we're expanding all these sort of capabilities. There's been a big push to automate and provide quantitative analysis for all these sort of settings, and to integrate all these experiments into each other. And in particular, there's always a sense that we're trying to get to the structure, and figuring out how we get that structural information back into the process and keep it central is going to be a big push. With that, I want to thank many people. First, my professor, Mary Scott, my PI, she's been very helpful and supportive throughout, and Dr. Catherine Situ and Catherine Groschner, who did much of the experimental work. I did none of it. And that data is crucial for me being able to analyze this at all. Dr. Colin Ofis, who was another staff scientist at the NSEM who I've done a lot of simulation work with, and Dr. Anwar Benali, who was my practical advisor, and of course, the Krell Institute. It's really nice to feel supported and wanted in this community, and I think you guys do a lot of work to make that happen. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.